What exactly is the dark web? Who first created it and why?
Yeah, so the web that we all use every day, that we're all familiar with, is usually referred to when we're talking in the context of the dark web as the surface web or the clear web. And that's what people are familiar with when you're going to, visit news sites or shop on Amazon or use Facebook or read news articles, things of that nature. The deep web is parts of the internet and the web that are not indexed by search engines. So the deep web isn't necessarily anything bad. That's all the back-end databases that might be maintained internally by companies, and when you log into your bank website, things like that, or you log into the internal websites where you work. So that's the deep web. And there's another part of the web that you could kind of think of as a subset of the deep web, and it's also not accessible from the clear web, and that's the dark web. And it requires special knowledge, tools, or software to access, and is a specialized network. So one of the most common examples of the dark web is something called the Tor network. That stands for the Onion Router, TOR. And this was actually first created in the mid-'90s, and it began as a project of actually the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory as a way to research ways to protect government communications. It has a long history of being funded as a research project by U.S. academic institutions and U.S. government agencies, and it actually still gets funding from the State Department, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Defense. But the times we hear about it most is, it's kind of this scary thing where there's, drug trades and, illicit weapons sales and child pornography and things like that. And those things go on the dark web too. But the dark web and Tor in particular is really just a tool that can be used for good or evil.
So how did it, obviously it went from being a government project or used by the government to now there are, quote unquote bad people that use it for illegal stuff. How did
Right.
that transition sort of happen?
Well, when you have any tool that really lets a user hide or conceal their identity and operate on the internet anonymously, that obviously has an attraction for criminal activity and illicit activity as well. And, the interesting thing is that, there's a group, one of the larger groups that uses Tor is democracy and political activists in, authoritarian regimes where that type of communication might be outlawed in that country. So, one nation's, free speech is another nation's illegal activity. So, again, it's just a tool. Now, in the context of the U.S. and the things that we always kind of hear about when we're talking about the dark web, things like drug sales and weapon trades, you can operate a website on the dark web that looks like a marketplace. Kind of think of it as like a bad Amazon or eBay type thing where people can bid on anything from stolen financial information, to ordering drugs and having it, shipped to them in the mail. So there's a lot of that kind of activity that goes on the dark web as well. But, Tor in particular, and we're using Tor as an example because that's just the most popular example of the dark web. It's now a nonprofit foundation. And they're still funded in part by grants that flow from U.S. government agencies, but also donations from users and pro-democracy organizations and things like that. So, there's kind of this dichotomy on the dark web of people using it to just anything as simple as protecting their own privacy, avoiding surveillance. Journalists use it to talk with sources. Whistleblowers use it. Political rights activists use it. but then there's also this shady or darker part of the dark web, if you will.
So I want people to kind of conceptualize it in their head. You have the surface level, then you have the deep web, then you have the dark web. So sort of 3 layers that we're talking about right now.
Right.
So the dark web, often called the wild, wild west of the internet, this is a place where there really are no rules. What's the government doing to kind of corral organizations in this dark web?
Well, the interesting thing about the dark web is that a lot of the tools that exist to create it and the things that make it secure and private and anonymous to a certain degree also work to prevent the government and law enforcement from easily finding or stopping illegal activity. So there's kind of 2 ways to use the Tor network. You can actually download a web browser that is based on Firefox and looks a lot like Firefox, a web browser that a lot of people use from torproject.org. And one way Tor can be used is you can use it to access sites on the clear web, just like a normal web browser. But it hides your identity. So if you have an internet address, say in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from your internet provider, and you visit a website, the website will see that, and they'll know that it's you. And if there's some kind of illegal activity going on, a law enforcement agency can get a warrant, and they'll be able to trace it back to your internet provider and your address. If you use Tor browser to access a website, it might look like you're coming from an internet address in Europe or Australia or Russia or anywhere in the world. And the reason why it's called the onion router is because it's kind of like the layers of the onion. There's multiple layers, multiple servers around the world that this traffic is going through, and it's very difficult to trace it back to you. But as with anything, there are ways that people can make mistakes. There are vulnerabilities in web browsers, and so if a federal law enforcement agency like the FBI is looking at an illicit drug website or a site that's selling stolen credentials or a site that's dealing in child pornography, they do have investigative techniques that have successfully unmasked, if you will, people who are either running or patronizing these websites.
So I feel like we are just beginning to understand how deep the web goes. I guess, how deep does it go? And is it sort of like the Matrix? We don't know quite yet.
Yeah, it goes pretty deep. Now, I think that, just to give people some context, the Tor network has about 2 million users per day. And you look at something like Facebook, Facebook has 2 billion users. So there's 3 orders of magnitude difference there. Just taking even one thing like Facebook and comparing it to the Tor network. But there's I said before, there's kind of 2 ways to use the Tor network, and one is just to use the Tor browser to protect your identity. The other way to use it is that you can actually access websites that are running within the dark web. And so instead of visiting a website like, say, CNN.com or the normal websites that you're familiar with that end in .org or .net, things like that, Tor network websites end in .onion. And just like on the clear web, those websites can be completely legal, completely benign, or they can be used for illegal activity. And when security researchers look at the kind of activity that's actually going on within the dark web on the websites that are within it, about half of them are legal. When you look at it in the context of our own legal system. And then there's a handful of them, probably about a quarter of them are involving drugs or explicit type content, illicit categories, again, like, drugs, hacking, weapons, exploits, extremism, things of that nature. So there's, as soon as the government conducts an investigation and takes down some of the larger markets, if they're able to actually trace it back to whoever is running it. There was just an example a couple weeks ago of that happening. A new market will pop up because if there's money to be made, or someone has a political or other motivation, they're going to continue using the dark web for these things.
So it's kind of interesting. The government created this, and now the government's having to sort of corral people on it as well. So it's this sort of dichotomy of good and bad, and
yeah, and again, it's just a tool. So there's it's not that it's inherently bad, but because of the level of privacy and anonymity it offers, it will attract some of these kind of darker activities. So the government still uses it itself. In fact, just last week, the Central Intelligence Agency announced that it was opening up shop itself with a dark web website. So there's a .onion site that the CIA has that's actually their full website, and there's a tip line on there so that activists or informants in other countries can actually reach out to the CIA with tips. And so they have a presence on there that they operate themselves, right alongside markets that are selling illegal weapons, which is kind of interesting.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share that might be interesting to our listeners that maybe I just haven't asked?
Well, I think the main thing that, I know I've said this a couple of times, I think the best way to think about the dark web is that it's a tool. Again, because of the anonymity it provides, it does attract people who want to use it for nefarious purposes. But people who just want to protect their privacy and obfuscate their identity when they're surfing online can use it for completely benign purposes. And I would tell people to not be afraid of the dark web in general, because it's not only a tool for illegal activity. It's a tool for people who maybe just want to protect themselves from fraud and keep their web browsing private. And you see a lot of the discussions that are happening today about privacy on the internet and large internet companies collecting your private data and that data then getting breached or sold. So Tor and the dark web is a way to kind of protect against those types of things too. So really the best way to think about it is a tool that can be used for good or bad.